Hi, my name's Joe Cernik. I'm a member of the faculty here at Lindenwood University, and I'd like to welcome you to Insight. Now, Insight is a show where we normally discuss books on politics, domestically, internationally, sometimes historical insight, books into the present, sometimes broader atmospheric trend analysis books that will have an impact on political developments. Today, we're not doing that. We're talking about a book written by an FBI criminal profiler who's looking at a specific serial killer. The book is written by John Douglas and Johnny Dodd. John Douglas is the FBI profiler. The title of the book is called Inside the Mind of BTK, the true story behind the 30-year hunt for the notorious Wichita serial killer. Now, joining me on the show today is a Lindenwood student, Alyson Kinstner, and I wanted to read and quote from the book so you can get a sense of what the book is about. So the authors write, criminal profilers do much more than draw up vague pictures of an unidentified perpetuator. In fact, the FBI has no official position designated as profiler. More times than not, the profiler will offer a range of suggested investigative methods. If the critics of profiling had themselves ever been involved in an actual criminal investigation, they would know that it's a useful tool among many other scientific, investigative, and forensic tools used in modern detective work. There's no absolute formula. As you come to read this book, you'll come to understand that criminal profiling is a subtle yet powerful investigative art. Now, the reason he writes that way, the critics, is he's specifically going after somebody named Malcolm Gladwell, who had written an article in which he was highly critical of profiling and saying that it doesn't work. And so the book, to some extent, is an attempt to show, wait a minute, don't look at it quite that way. You're trying to understand that it isn't quite a simple formula and it takes a long time. And after all, you're looking at a situation, just to put this in some broader thing, is BTK stands for bind, torture, and kill. The man that they will eventually catch is accused of killing 10 people. I think there was some attempt to figure out if he'd actually killed more than that. And he kills the first 4 of these 10 in January of 1974. Then he kills again in April of 1974. But now you jump ahead until March of 1977, and then you jump ahead to December of 1977. Then you jump way ahead to April of 1985. And then you jump ahead to September of 1986. Then you jump ahead again to January of 1991. So eventually he's being linked to 10 killings that span the years 1974 to 1991, but they don't arrest him until 2005. So So it's a very long process.
I think this book was just fascinating to read all of these things and understand how he, originally they found out that he had killed 7, and then when he finally was captured and everything like that, it came out that he had actually killed 10. But one of the most fascinating parts about this that even John Douglas couldn't quite understand for the longest time until the end of the book, he lets you in on the secret, how did he kill from 74 to 78 or in that time frame, and then took a break for, it seemed like, for several years until the 1980.
Yeah, you're talking about an 8-year break there between one series, and then suddenly he lies low. I thought one of the fascinating parts of this book was it takes them quite a few years to believe it's the same person, that you can link to different killings. So they didn't realize that they were having a serial killer on their hands it took them several years to actually get to that point.
And the thing that was really even more interesting to me is that, yes, like you said, that they couldn't connect him because I guess in a way he changed his MO, is what he explained it as, because in the first murder, the Otero murders, he had killed all these 4, and basically it seemed as his main target was the 11-year-old girl Josephine, because that's where his sexual pleasure came from, not the mother in that case. He had strangled everyone, but the little boy, Joey is what they called him, he was 9. He died from asphyxiation. But then if you look at the other murder that at first they couldn't connect with the things until he had written a letter to the police officers, was the Kathy Bright murder, because they didn't connect it because there was her brother had came in the shooting, or was there during the murder, but then he ended up trying to shoot him, and he actually got away even though he was shot twice. So that's why they didn't connect it, is because originally in the first murders they didn't know he had a gun, because there's no survivors to tell the story of how he got in, how they got tied up, or anything like that. So that's what Kathy Bright, when they finally connected all of those murders together, they realized that they had someone that was a witness that could basically tell how he got in the house, how he was able to get them tied up, and anything like that. So Kathy Bright's brother actually told him that he comes in with a ruse saying, like, I'm a criminal. If you guys just tie yourselves up, give me money, give me your car, give me food, I'll leave you alone, nobody will be harmed. So he gets them to tie themselves up, and then they realize, oh wait, he's really lying. He's actually going to take this to the next step. So he had tied up Kathy Bright's brother, and then when he started to get out of hand, he tried to just put a bullet through him, and then it looked as if he had toppled over and was out, but then he went to take care of Kathy, and her brother eventually got up, so he tried to shoot him again. And then he ran and tried to get help, because he decided that the best way to help his sister in the situation was get help and try and get them there as soon as possible, rather than trying to take care of the murderer himself. But unfortunately, it was too late. By the time the cops got there, she had bled out, and all of her internal organs were punctured, and just really there was no coming back from it.
One of the things, again, that, and we've discussed this on a previous show regarding the same author, is I find, and it weaves itself through this book, is how to talk to the killer through the media. So he said, I emphasized to police that BTK's ego would eventually lead to his downfall. Their job, I wrote, was to stroke his ego in public whenever possible, to show him the respect he craved in the hopes that he would continue to communicate with them, because that's essentially what ends up happening, is he will begin to communicate. In fact, after the Wichita Police Department realizes they're dealing with a serial killer, they create a special unit to go after BTK, which they called the Ghostbusters.
That was really interesting, and another thing Douglas pointed out was that they needed a super cop, is what he called it, someone that could stand up in front of the audience and basically communicate to not only the public but really target the individual himself. And they said that eventually, if you build up so much like confidence within the killer himself and really stroke his ego, like you said, that the suspect will allow himself to take chances and risks that he wouldn't otherwise, because you stroked his ego so much that he's getting so confident that eventually he's going to take these chances and hurt himself in the long run.
They disbanded the Ghostbusters in 1987, and what he mentions in here is they weren't sure whether or not he had stopped killing, or maybe he was killing but in some ways had changed his MO, so they weren't quite sure. And so it's interesting how you deal with so much uncertainty, because again, if you're disbanding the Ghostbusters in 1987, he's still got one more murder after that, which is until 1991.
The sad thing about it is that since all of his crimes were before 1994, he wasn't even eligible for the death penalty, which even Douglas, he says that not necessarily that he's always a fan of the death penalty, but he said for someone like BTK, he needed to just be gone, for that matter, because of how much terror he actually put everyone through for the around 30-year time span of him being killing and being underground and everything like that. And they said that even when he was underground, they didn't know if he was put in a mental institution, if he was incarcerated for other crimes. But in his letters that he had originally written, the first letter said that serial killers, or something along the lines of serial killers, don't change their MO. And that's exactly what Douglas said. As little does he know, actually serial killers do. They improve their MO. That's basically how they take out their crime. Like, the gun wasn't part of his MO or anything like that. But his, I forgot what it was called, the signature. His signature never changed per se. And that was the bind, torturing, and killing of his victims, unfortunately.
Yeah, there is this, and it weaves through a previous book that we discussed on by John Douglas, is that serial killers seem to get better. They are perfecting and they're learning from mistakes they've made. And so that was to some extent what you were trying to sort of look at here as you were in other ones. I thought it was interesting. His suggestion, again, how you communicate, was he said you create something called the super cop. And the super cop is that you only have one person in law enforcement talk through the media, and that the idea is that one individual literally isn't talking to the public, but talking specifically to the killer. In this case, when they catch him in 2005, his name is Dennis Rader, and he was married. He had gone to college, got a degree, and he was the father of 2 kids, and he was very active in his church.
I thought it was...
And a Cub Scout leader.
Oh yeah, it was really interesting to see all this, because he had explained that originally his first profile, he said that this person wouldn't be able to have relationships with others. There's no way that he would be married or anything like that, and it turns out that he did. But as you could see, as time went on, he changed his profile for him. And it turned out that he had profiled and said that this person would be very smart, but just wouldn't really put in all of his effort in school, so he was just an average student, but you could see he had potential, that he would be a loner in general. And there were several stories that they went on after they had captured him, where he went back and talked to some of his classmates, John Douglas did. And one of them had discussed how he was always very well reserved, and it's not that he wasn't very, like, popular. I don't want to say the word popular, but they said that he was a nice person and that people generally would want to hang out with him. He just always was reserved and kind of made sure that he wasn't around others. And in a way, it kind of showed that he didn't want his inner self to come out, so he tried to avoid contact with others. And a lot of those times when he wasn't with others, he was sneaking off to a barn to hang animals. And in a previous book we discussed, we had said how one of the 3 things that you learn in a childhood of a criminal was that they'll torture little kids or animals.
Yeah. The other thing to note, I think, about this book is that John Douglas was allowed to interview Rader, and so Rader spent time talking with him when he was in prison. And one of the things that he noted that Rader did was he praised Son of Sam, so that the killings that were taking place in New York City in the 1970s, that Rader had a high opinion of David Horowitz. And so then Rader critiqued Douglas's analysis of his profiling, so that as a result, again, one of the things that Douglas talks about, he mentions it in this book, and he mentions it in a previous book that we had discussed, that he interviewed serial killers. And so this is how he develops his profiling technique.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is, like, as we had addressed earlier, how serial killers change and, I guess, not benefit their MO, but perfect their MO. That's the word I'm looking for. They perfect their MO. He said that as he went through all of these interviews with their celebrity criminals over time, they perfected their interviewing skills like one would perfect the MO. And what was interesting is they went back and interviewed Son of Sam, and they kind of told Son of Sam, hey, there's this guy in Wichita now that's really a big fan of you. He wants a nickname like you do, and really just talked Son of Sam up. So Son of Sam ended up coming out and giving way more information that they had ever expected. More information on his personal life, how he grew up and stuff like that, which kind of allowed them to learn and change how they were looking at BTK, because they were kind of similar in the way that everything was about sexual arousal, and it was very, very brutal what they would do to their victims, unfortunately.
Yeah, here was a list of some of the people that they interviewed Charles Manson, Sirhan, he killed Robert Kennedy, Arthur Bremer, Richard Speck, John Wayne Gacy, David Horowitz, who was son of Sam, and James Earl Ray. And so as a result, from these interviews, this is how you start to create some profiling techniques.
Also, when I remember, I believe it was in this book, the son of Sam, when he went and discussed with him, he originally opened up with talking about the John Benet Ramsey case. And he was talking about how Douglas personally didn't believe that her family had anything to do with it, that the way that they had found the body was just not something a parent can typically do to their child. Normally, a parent, if they were trying to cover something up like that, it would be much more like solemn, if that makes sense. And you could see that Son of Sam was kind of getting bored with someone else's killings, that he needed someone to stroke his ego, like we had discussed before, that he didn't really care about someone else's work because to him, his work was the best.
BTK, then, it seems like he goes public that it's him because he seems annoyed that somebody else was taking his credit. And so somebody went forward to say he did it, and then he didn't. But that annoyed him enough that now he felt the need to communicate to the public, and not just with letters, but he wrote a poem. And there's his poem is somewhere in the book about going through, here's what he wants to do. And again, as is the case with how John Douglas looks at serial killers, he's going back to a childhood series of problems. And so I noticed one of the things they were doing is they were interviewing, I think it was some of his teachers, Rader's teachers, where they had found him tying up little girls when he was in grade school.
And he drew a dungeon at one point. It was, I forgot what he called it. It was like a girl dungeon, I think is what he called it for. And you could see it was him and two of his friends. But as a teacher came over after they had drawn all of this stuff, the other two boys kind of looked like they had done something wrong, and they kind of understand that they were in the wrong and what they had done was just not okay. And Rader actually just went on and was just so pleased with what he had just came up with, all of his torture chambers and all the things that he had put in there. He thought it was fascinating. He didn't see what was wrong with the situation. So it kind of shows that even at a young age there was something a little off, that maybe that should have been a trigger of, this boy needs help. Someone needs to look into this.
Yeah, this was this series of exchanges with Horowitz, which when he opens up, he says, we're FBI agents, David. We'd like to talk to you. We're hoping you might be able to help us. And so Horowitz is very surprised. He said, and they're going on over here, he says, it's like I always said, if you want to learn how to paint, you don't read about it in the book, you go straight to the artist. And that's what you are, David. You're an artist. And Horowitz is very surprised, and he goes, why me? I ain't no artist. And then he says, what the hell are you talking about? You're famous, you're huge, you had all of New York City scared shitless. And no one has ever done that. And 100 years from now, they're going to remember your name, but they won't remember me. And so then this is how you stroked Horowitz's ego, and Horowitz is then going on, and he's now sitting there and being told about BTK, and now you're having this sort of mutual admiration society in many cases, and so they're trying to get some insight from this process.
They said that when they stroked his ego, that eventually he became like putty in their hands. So he actually agreed to do the 57-page questionnaire that they had came up with that really went in to detail about everything about his life, whether it was from the beginning or during his crimes. And you could tell that originally he had said with some of the people that he had interviewed through times, some of them would open up because they were bored, they were curious, and he said some of them loved to talk about it because it brought back up the details that they had done, and it was basically playing into their fantasies again, and it got them to another level of sexual pleasure again, just talking about the crimes.
I thought the part where he said what they did was when they realized they were dealing with a serial killer, they organized community meetings to have people in the areas where people were killed get together and publicize it widely. And then what they did was they took pictures of everybody that attended these meetings because they were hoping that the killer would show up at one of them. I didn't get the feeling that he did. From this, they're discussing this, but there's no indication that they actually had it.
I think towards the end they had brought up and they had discussed with him, like, have you ever went to any of your crime scenes again or anything like that? And he had addressed that. He's like, I would drive by from time to time of where I committed the murders, but he's like, I never went anywhere in public when they were discussing it or anything like that because I knew it would be too risky. I wasn't going to go to those things because I felt like it was putting myself too far out there, which was another issue with not necessarily the profiling, but he was just very sophisticated compared to some other killers because he knew putting himself in that situation would really, I guess, open the idea of him being a suspect.
He talks about the idea that BTK, reason he went public was he was annoyed that he wasn't receiving the attention that other famous killers were. And then he goes down a list of who they were, so why. And he talks about the idea that he felt he was in a, quote, backwater media market. So
I loved that quote.
So as a result of that, now he wanted the attention. And so how to get it?
And they had found that he had written other letters, but I guess they had never gotten to them prior or something like that. But what was interesting is that it was the backwater media market as well as the other guy trying to take the attention. And the weird thing about the other guy is when he had spoke up, he said, if I were to have done the Otero murders, this is what I would have done. I would have gotten my brother and I would have gotten our friend. And they said basically that by looking at these three men, they knew it was not possible, first off, with the, I guess, the thought process that they had and stuff like that. And they didn't know anything until when finally the letter came in. It basically excused those men and were like, this is not you guys, because this person knows word for word what the crime looked like before it was even disturbed by the children. Right. And that was really the set-off point of, wow, we really are dealing with this serial murder, because he knows all of the details about all of these people. And like I said, before they were disturbed, and as well as saying, I've also killed one other person that you haven't connected with me yet. So not only did he do the Otero for the two parents and the two children, but he did the Vian murder, the Fox murder, and eventually they connected the Kathy Bright murder as well.
He spends a lot of time in this book and others talking about organized and disorganized killing. So organized is where you're having a serial killer, and disorganized is that momentary spur. And then he says, his homicides were difficult to pigeonhole because they possessed elements of both organization and disorganization. He was a control freak who came prepared, often arriving at the homes of the victims with ropes, gags, guns, and a knife. He didn't use force to convince his victims to go along with him. He used bullshit. He pretended to be a relatively harmless thug, using words to manipulate his victims into allowing themselves to be tied up, usually without any struggle. And so as a result, this is why it was somewhat difficult to start to tie some of these murders together.
And the crazy thing that they had went on to address is, again, about perfecting the MO, is he perfected his. So at first, the first crimes, you could tell that there was a little disorganization in it because of the things that happened that were out of his control that he didn't plan for. So then eventually, as time went on, he learned to improv. And then he got so comfortable in his killings because he could really control every situation. Even if it wasn't what his fantasy had portrayed, he knew that even if this had happened, he could work his way around it. Like when he tried to murder, I believe her name was Shirley Vian, he tied her kids up, well, not tied her kids up, but put her kids in the bathroom and then tried to tie everything up. And eventually, when the police chief walked in, or one of the police officers walked in, he saw how the binding and everything was, and it triggered something to him as, this is something I've seen before. This is definitely the connection between the murders of the Otero and the Vian murder itself.
And again, and you see this referred to, Douglas talks about this in other places, where killers will take trinkets, souvenirs. And so as a result, that's what he did. He took trinkets of the people he killed because that helped his fantasies.
I thought in this section also, they talked about that, but they also went on to talk about how it looked like he'd set up his murders, like the people in them, straight out of a detective magazine is basically what they had said. And the quote that just fascinated me is that they said that he laid the bodies down the way a florist would arrange flowers, and that he put that much detail in not only the murders but how he left the scene. So this also went on to talk about something that was another issue, basically in another book that he had written, and it said, are these detective magazines actually basically pornography for these sexual sadists? Are they learning things from these, and eventually are they forming their ideas from these magazines and eventually taking them out into the world and killing because of what they had seen?
He talks about that because then he goes off into an aside about the idea of two people from, I think it was an Air Force, who had killed, and they got inspiration about how to do it from a Clint Eastwood movie, but that the Clint Eastwood movie was more clean in how people died because they died quickly from drinking poison, whereas the killers didn't realize that people were going to suffer and go into great agony. It would take a very long period of time.
Oh, absolutely. He had explained that basically he was taking away their right to a fast murder, a fast death, that he was making them draw this out. And when you really look at the first murder, I feel like this was probably the most extreme of this case, because first he got rid of the father, the most powerful in the situation, so he was gone. And the children most likely heard this, saw this, and then he took out the mother, the second most powerful, and then he killed the little boy, just got rid of him, and then Josephine, the little 11-year-old that he was really after, per se, had to watch all of this, and then he proceeded to hang her from a pole to where just her tiptoes could touch. So if she could be on her tiptoes as long as she needed to, then she wouldn't necessarily die. But after hanging there that long, that's not physically possible. So she was strangled, as well as after she had died, he proceeded to masturbate onto her leg. And it had been so long till when the other children of the family got home that it had dripped down off of her into a puddle. And they said that the puddle was so big that they didn't know if it was from multiple killers or not, but there was no way to figure that out.
Yeah, and it was interesting how I guess later on they find out that when he was killing, he liked to talk dirty to him. So again, sex runs through a lot of this, and you begin to see that. In fact, they talk about, again, weaving itself through it, is this is their version of having sex, and so not exactly way to think of it in any normal way.
What they had said is that what he did was all about the need to script, direct, and produce a crime to fulfill his fantasies of dominance and control. So basically in his head, he already, even if they were already dead, he was going to continue to gag them, continue to necessarily, he wasn't after with Josephine to have sex with her. There was no penetration of any of his victims. It was the idea and the fantasy that he had laid out for himself. So even if he didn't necessarily need to do that, he did that to show that that's what happened in his fantasy. And they had addressed that basically when these people were dead, they were no longer humans to him. They were simply flesh-covered mannequins or just props to him. And that was terrifying but fascinating to read about, because the fantasy always came before the murder itself. But he was really never after sex per se, but the crimes, the killings themselves, and the torturing and hanging gave him sexual arousal.
We only have a moment left. What did you think of the book?
Loved it, and I feel like, not to spoil it, but when you find out why he took the breaks that he did was very fascinating. So I think someone should definitely read this book if they have any interest in it.
Yeah, I found it a very good book, and certainly that the author was actively involved in this investigation. You get a sense of how this begins to develop. So thick book, but a quick read.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you for joining us.